Japan is the only country on Earth where leaving a generous tip at a restaurant can cause the server to sprint after you down the street. She will hold the money out with both hands, and she will say, with complete sincerity, "Excuse me, you forgot this." You didn't forget it, but there is no clean way to explain that in the middle of an Osaka street to someone who is already smiling. A country of 125 million people running on a social code so specific, so quietly enforced, and so deeply expected that most locals could not fully explain it to you even if you asked. Nobody teaches it, nobody writes it down, and when 42.7 million tourists arrived in 2025, not one of them got a single word of warning at the gate. Most of them figured it out the hard way. Break these rules and you will not get arrested, you will get something more effective. The look. The kind that crosses a packed train platform in half a second. We're giving you the rulebook today, all of it. The invisible code. One idea explains almost everything on this list. Wa, written with the same kanji that also means Japan itself, wa is social harmony, the unspoken collective decision that everyone will make life smoother for the group. Not because it is enforced, but because when you pack that many people into spaces this small, it is the only thing that actually works. Here's what it looks like in practice. Someone bumps into you in most countries and you get a shrug, maybe a half word. In Japan, the person who bumped you bows and apologizes, even if you stepped into them. At a Tokyo train platform, 400 people can board in under 90 seconds without a single elbow, because every last person queued at the painted line and waited their turn. No announcement, no enforcement, just wa. Once you understand that each rule exists to protect the experience of the whole group, the rules stop feeling like a test. They start feeling obvious. And the highest stakes arena for all of it is somewhere you'll walk into within 20 minutes of arriving. The holy ground. Japan's trains are precision instruments. The Shinkansen averages delays of under 1 minute per trip. Regular subways arrive at the exact second on the board. Inside those cars, silence is the social contract. Nobody is mid-call in a crowded car. Nobody is having a full conversation across the aisle. Manner mode is the local term. Phone on silent, calls happen off the train. The whole system runs on not intruding on the person beside you. Backpack? In a crowded car, take it off and hold it in front of you. A bag on your back in a packed train occupies the space of the person directly behind you. You are, for all practical purposes, wearing another person without their knowledge or consent. Priority seats near the doors stay empty even when the car looks half deserted. You can't know who boards at the next stop. Do not sit there unless you genuinely need to. The escalator divide between Tokyo and Osaka is entirely real and completely unresolved. In Tokyo, you stand on the left and leave the right open for walkers. In Osaka, the whole thing flips. Stand right, walk left. This traces back to 1967, when Osaka's Umeda Station instructed riders to keep the left side clear, reportedly inspired by how it was done in London. Tokyo drifted the opposite direction organically, and neither city has moved since. Ask a Japanese person which is correct, and watch the pause before they answer. Get it wrong, and nobody speaks, but you will feel the slow, coordinated turn of several heads in your direction. Last rule, the painted queue lines on the platform floor, in front of every single door. You stand inside them, wait in order, and board in sequence. In most cities, this is an aspiration. In Japan, everyone actually does it. All of that, and we haven't even sat down to eat yet. The food minefield. This section has more unspoken rules per square meter than anywhere else in Japan, and most are the kind you only discover by breaking them. 2 phrases change every meal you eat here. Before the first bite, itadakimasu. It means I humbly receive, and it's genuine gratitude for the food, the effort, and the lives behind it. When you're finished, gochiso-sama. Roughly, thank you for the feast. Japanese servers notice when visitors say these. The warmth in the room shifts. Learn both. Use them every time. Walking and eating is frowned upon in most of Japan. There are exceptions. Dotonbori in Osaka and Harajuku's food stalls in Tokyo are built for eating. But in everyday streets and transit areas, eating while walking reads as carelessness. Eat where you bought the food. Noodles, abandon every Western table manner you own and slurp, without hesitation. The noise is good form. It aerates the noodles, sharpens the flavor, and signals to the cook the bowl is landing. Every ramen shop, every soba counter. Slurp. Sushi, the fish side touches the soy sauce, not the rice. Rice absorbs soy sauce instantly and falls apart. Don't mix extra wasabi into your soy sauce either. The chef has already placed exactly the right amount on your piece. Adding more politely implies they miscalculated. Chopsticks, two taboos that sit closer to sacred than social. Never stand them upright in rice. That's the exact position used in funeral offerings to the deceased, and Japanese diners recognize it immediately. And never pass food chopstick to chopstick. That act, called hashi watashi, mirrors the Buddhist funeral ritual of passing cremated bone fragments between family members. Even people who can't name the reason feel the discomfort the moment it happens. Place food on someone's plate instead. Tipping, don't. Now you know why the server from the opening was running. Japanese hospitality runs on omotenashi, unconditional service given because it's the right thing to do, not because a tip might follow. An industry group called the Tip Promotion Association launched in 2021 specifically to normalize tipping in Japan. It shut down in 2023. Quick pause. If this kind of thing is useful to you, hit subscribe. We cover travel culture, hidden rules, and how places actually work beneath the surface. Plenty more in the library already. The trash paradox. Japan is consistently ranked among the cleanest countries on Earth. Japan also has almost no public trash cans. Both are completely true. After the 1995 Tokyo subway sarin attack, when a doomsday cult hid nerve gas packages inside station trash bins and killed 12 people while injuring thousands, most public trash cans were removed from train stations as a security measure. The decision spread far beyond stations. A 2025 Japan Tourism Agency survey of 4,000 foreign visitors found the lack of public bins was the single biggest inconvenience they encountered. Nearly 22.2% cited it as their top complaint, more than language barriers, more than overcrowding. Most tourists spend their first day in Tokyo walking for hours with an empty coffee cup, scanning every corner for a bin. It is never around the next one. The cultural root of this is a concept called motenai, which means something close to don't waste, but more specifically, your mess is your responsibility. You carry it. You do not put it on the street and make it everyone else's problem. Bins are at convenience stores and some vending machine stations. Carry a small bag from your first morning. You stop thinking about it by day 2. The slipper trap. Shoes come off at the genkan, the raised entry step, when you walk into a home, a ryokan, most traditional restaurants, and many temples. Toilet slippers. In every traditional space, there's a separate pair outside the bathroom, specifically for use inside it. You swap into them when you enter, you swap back when you leave. The pair is almost always visually distinct from the house slippers. There's sometimes a mat marking the boundary. And still, every week across ryokans throughout Japan, a guest shuffles back to the tatami dining room in toilet slippers, sits down, picks up their tea, and then reads the full situation in the quiet expression of the staff member walking toward them. It is, at this point, a rite of passage. Layer 3, tatami. These woven rice straw floor mats are expensive and treated accordingly. No shoes, no slippers. Socks or bare feet only. Walk on tatami in slippers and you leave marks that are not cheap to fix. Those are the rules for places you enter fully clothed. What comes next involves none of that, and it is where most first-timers feel the most unprepared. The onsen code. An onsen is a natural hot spring bath, and Japan has over 2,300 of them. They are one of the genuine highlights of any trip. They come with the least flexible rules on this list. Wash first, thoroughly at the shower stations provided. The communal pool is for soaking once you're clean, not for cleaning yourself. This is the most important rule in the space, and the most commonly broken one, almost exclusively by visitors who simply didn't know. No swimwear in traditional onsens. The small towel is for modesty in transit and stays out of the water. Tattoos. Many traditional onsens still refuse entry to anyone with visible tattoos. The reason is traceable. During Japan's Edo period, tattoos were used to mark convicted criminals. Later, Yakuza members adopted full-body tattooing as a symbol of identity and defiance, and bathhouses banned ink specifically to keep them out. That association hasn't fully dissolved. A 2023 survey by a major Japanese onsen portal found roughly 44% of respondents still believe tattoos should be prohibited. Some facilities now allow small tattoos covered with a skin-toned bandage from any drugstore. Check the policy before you arrive, because they vary significantly. No phones anywhere near the bathing area. Not for a second. No exceptions for anyone. Streets, shrines, and real fines. A few habits that locals follow instinctively and visitors almost never notice until they've already missed them. Jaywalking is genuinely rare in Japan. On a completely empty residential street, Japanese pedestrians still wait for the green light. There are no police watching. The system works because everyone chooses to follow it. At a Shinto shrine, bow once before walking through the torii gate. Walk the sides of the approach path, not the center, which is reserved for the deity. At the Temizuya, the stone water pavilion inside the grounds, rinse your hands with the ladle. Left hand first, then right. At the main hall, 2 deep bows, 2 claps at chest height, a moment of silent prayer, 1 final bow. At a Buddhist temple, skip the clapping. Clapping is Shinto protocol. Japan has tens of thousands of both shrines and temples, and getting them confused at the prayer step is the most common mistake visitors make. In Kyoto's Gion district, as of April 2024, several private alleyways were officially closed to tourists, with fines up to 10,000 yen for entering. This followed years of visitors blocking narrow lanes and disturbing residents to photograph Gaiko and Maiko, Kyoto's traditional female performers. The signs are posted clearly. The fines are being collected. The era of "there is no sign saying I cannot" has passed in Gion. Don't point directly at people or objects. Open palm. Keep public displays of affection subdued. Be aware of your footprint in shared spaces. None of it is criminal. All of it is felt. Win them over. Not rules, just a few habits that quietly change the texture of your entire trip from the moment you start using them. 5 phrases. Sumimasen, excuse me, or I'm sorry. Arigatou gozaimasu, thank you, respectful version. Itadakimasu and gochiso-sama, which you already have, use them every meal without exception. And oishi, meaning delicious. Say it genuinely after something good and watch the cook's face. The bow, a sincere forward nod from the neck, is all you need. The attempt is what counts, not the angle. Gift giving. Present with both hands, wrap it properly, and never give sets of 4. The Japanese word for 4, shi, is the same sound as the word for death. Hotels skip the 4th floor. Some Shinkansen trains skip seat row 4. A gift of 4 of anything carries a weight nobody at the table will name, and everyone will register. Sets of 3, 5, or 8 are fine. Cash. Japan is still largely cash-dependent outside cities. Carry yen from the moment you land. Running out at a 700 yen ramen counter with a line behind you is a specific kind of helpless. And that motenai principle extends to the table too. Finish your plate. Use what you are given. It runs quietly through everything here. The real reason. Here's what all these rules actually add up to. A country with 42.7 million annual visitors and still spotless streets, trains to the minute, and strangers who bow after bumping into you. That's not coincidence. It's the result of a shared agreement built across generations that public space belongs to everyone, and everyone is responsible for how they treat it. You're not expected to be perfect. Japanese people are genuinely patient with anyone visibly making an effort, but showing up with awareness, trying the phrases, following the cue, leaving things the way you found them, that's the difference between visiting Japan and actually experiencing it. The temples are extraordinary. The food is unlike anything. The cities operate with a coordinated calm that feels almost too smooth to be real. But none of that is why Japan stays with people long after they leave. It stays because for the first time in most people's travel lives, they find themselves somewhere that everybody, without being asked and without being watched, is choosing to make it better for everyone else. The rules are not restrictions. They are an invitation. Share this with anyone heading to Japan. Subscribe for more, and until then, itadakimasu.